What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we are looking at round number 7 of the ongoing World Chess Championship match between Ding Liren of China, the defending world champion, and Gukesh D of India, the challenger. And here we go. In the game, Gukesh is playing as white. Now, so far in this match, he has opened one e4 and one d4 as white, but in this game, he does go one knight to f3, the ready opening. And now Ding Liren, how does he respond? He goes d5, gaining space in the center. That is the standard move at the highest level for black. Now here, Gukesh, he does go for the move g3, heading for sort of a King's Indian attack setup. Of course, his idea is bishop g2, short castles, and so on. And from there, he has many different playable ideas. Now here, Ding Liren, the main way he does respond to this opening from white, at least in the past, is knight f6, then c5, then e6, heading for sort of a Queen's Gambit decline style structure. However, instead in this game, he does not go for his standard setup. Instead, he plays the move g6, intending bishop g7 and short castles himself. Now, this move order is very, very tricky. Let's say white goes bishop g2 and then black goes bishop g7. Then black is threatening e5 as the bishop does control the e5 square. That does virtually force white to go d4 at some point. Therefore, black is headed for sort of a fianchetto Grunfeld style structure. Now here, white does go d4 immediately. That is the standard move, either immediately or after bishop g2. Now here, black, bishop g7. And how does Gukesh want to proceed? Well, the main question is, do you want to go c4, gaining space on the queen side in the spirit of the Queen's Gambit opening, or do you want to delay that and play something else? Now, in the game, he does go c4 immediately. And now, the benefit of black's move order, he does have the option of just playing d takes c4 immediately, opening up the center, and from there, he would have roughly equal chances, as white does have a very hard time fighting for an opening advantage in that line. Now, instead here, Ding Liren, he's playing solid. He does go c6, again, in the spirit of the fianchetto Grunfeld. Now, in the fianchetto Grunfeld, black typically goes c6 before d5, but either way, we do reach the main line here. Now here, white, bishop g2, knight f6, and then both sides do castles and castles. And now here, white, he really has to show his plan. What does he want to do here in this position? Well, it turns out he has literally a million different ideas. For example, you can trade on d5. That does reach a symmetrical style position after c takes d5, but it is very playable. Beyond that, moves like knight e5, knight c3, queen b3, a4, knight d2, knight to a3, and so on. Literally, everything is playable as white here. Now, in the game, Gukesh, he plays an ultra rare move as white. This move is almost never seen at the highest level, and it is slightly dubious, but it does have a very dangerous attacking idea behind it. Here, Gukesh plays the move rook to e1, sliding the rook over one square. Now, what is the idea behind this move? It's very simple. If black goes d takes c4, that is technically the strongest move here as black. Then white's going to go e4, and the rook is perfectly placed on e1, supporting the pawn on e4. And overall, white would have a very dangerous attacking position with those two pawns on d4 and e4. He'd have one more central pawn than black, sort of in the spirit of a King's Gambit opening, except the pawn on c4 is the one being gambited. Now here, of course, Ding Liren, he does not have to take on c4. For example, he can just go, say, bishop f5, developing the bishop, maybe a5, and so on. But instead, Ding Liren, he's a very principled player, very tactical. He does take on c4. D takes c4 is the move. And now, of course, Gukesh, the only logical follow-up to rook to e1 is going to be e4, and that is what he plays in the game. e4 on the board, and now we have a very interesting middle game position. Both sides have castled. White is down a pawn, but he does have the extra central pawn in the center. Of course, he has those two central pawns versus the one of black, and that means white is going to have very aggressive attacking ideas here in this position. Now, of course, it is Ding Liren's turn to move. How does he want to proceed? Well, it's actually kind of hard to find the best idea for black here. Does he want to support that pawn with a move like b5 or a5 and then b5? Or does he want to develop his pieces? Well, it turns out the strongest move here is not going b5 or a5 immediately. Instead, the computer wants you to go knight to a6, with the point being the knight is threatening jumping into knight b4 and then knight d3 later in the game, and black can always go b5 if needed to support the pawn on c4. Now, instead, Ding Liren plays a more active move. That is simply bishop to g4, flying out with the bishop, and of course, g4 is a very typical square for the bishop in this Grunfeld structure. Now here, white How does he want to proceed? Well, it is important to note, first of all, that bishop on g4 does pin the knight on f3 to the queen on d1. That could be annoying. Of course, that pawn on d4 is not vulnerable yet. For example, after bishop takes f3, white can recapture with the bishop, keeping the queen, defending the pawn on d4. So white is not at risk of losing any material. However, the queen does need to stay on d1 for right now. For example, if white went, say, queen to c2, then after bishop takes, queen takes d4, black does win a pawn. So that queen is restricted a little bit in terms of where it can go right now. Now, with that in mind, what are the best options for white? Well, you can support the knight on f3 with the knight. For example, knight d2 is a very solid move, supporting the knight and threatening knight takes c4. Beyond that, you can go, say, knight a3 or a4, expanding on the queen side. Now, in the game, Gukesh, he does play perhaps the most logical move for white here. That is just knight d2, again, developing the knight and supporting the other knight on the f3 square. Now, Ding Liren, how should he proceed here? Well, the computer says the strongest move in this position is b5, gaining space on the queen side and defending the pawn on c4. You will be up a pawn permanently. However, the drawback of this move, it does weaken the light squares on the queen side a little bit, especially that pawn on c6, and this Catalan-style bishop on g2 is going to be very, very strong for the rest of the game. Now, instead of that Ding Liren, he goes for a much simpler, less combative option. That is just the move c5. And of course, c5 is a very standard breaking idea in both the Queen's Gambit Decline and in the Grunfeld. And now here, black's idea, he's threatening c takes d4. He's trying to liquidate white's very powerful pawn center. And if he can do that, he will have an excellent game. Of course, Gukesh cannot allow that. Therefore, a move like d5 or e5 immediately is required. Now, in the game, Gukesh did go d5. That is perhaps the strongest move here, but I do want to point out there is another very interesting pawn sacrifice. That is the move e5, and after knight d7 or knight d5, you can threaten e6, sacrificing a pawn. For example, e5, knight d7, then e6, forcing f takes e6. That would be a very interesting sequence of moves, but instead, Gukesh does play d5. That is perhaps the strongest move here. And now white has the very strong pawns on d5 and e4. Therefore, Ding Liren is going to have to counterattack that pawn structure immediately. And he does that with the modern Berenice-style move, e6, threatening e takes d5. Try to make that very strong pawn on d5 a weak, isolated pawn. So Ding Liren finding the absolute strongest move here. Now, Gukesh, how should he proceed in this position? Well, he's got a few different ideas. The computer loves the move knight takes c4, simply regaining that lost pawn immediately on c4 and threatening ideas like bishop f4 and knight d6 later in the game. That knight would be very strong on d6, of course. Now, instead of that here, Gukesh does go h3, putting the question to the bishop, where do you want to go? Well, turns out there are no good retreat squares. Therefore, if bishop takes f3, he is virtually forced. That is what's played by Ding. Bishop takes f3, and now here bishop takes, and then e takes and e takes for Ding. So Ding Liren completing his idea of trading on d5 and making that pawn on d5 a weak, isolated pawn. Now, very importantly, that pawn on d5 is being attacked twice by the knight and the queen, and it's only defended once by the bishop on f3. Therefore, black has two attackers versus the one defender. Can you trade on d5 immediately? Well, you can, but it turns out that is not a good idea at all. If you go knight takes d5, then the move for white is just knight takes d4. He has two pieces attacking that knight on d5, and beyond that, if the knight moves, let's say knight f6 retreating, then bishop takes b7 wins the rook on a8, as then the rook is trapped. It is entombed on the a8 square, and it will be lost. Therefore, knight takes d5 is a little bit dubious. White has too much pressure in the center, and especially on this long diagonal with the Catalan-style bishop on f3. Therefore, instead, knight bd7 is the move for Ding Liren, and now knight takes c4 finally regains that lost pawn on the c4 square. Now, of course, the main imbalance in this position, there are two. Number one, white has the very strong but potentially weak isolated pawn on d5. Again, that pawn could be an asset or a weakness. It just depends on how the game goes. Beyond that, white also has the bishop pair. There's two Bs on f3 and c1 versus the one B on g7 of Ding Liren. And that bishop pair in an open position like this one is a huge asset. So with that in mind, overall, thanks to those two Bs, Gukesh does have a slight advantage out of the opening. This is exactly what he wanted when he plays knight f3 and then g3 in the opening phase of the game. Now, Ding Liren, how does he want to proceed? Well, in the game, he finds the absolute strongest move. That is b5, immediately counterattacking on the queen side. Very importantly, if you don't play that, Gukesh is going to have a beautiful position. For example, let's say you go knight b6, putting pressure on the knight. Then white can go knight to a5, putting pressure on b7, and he would have a terrific position. Beyond that, let's say Gukesh, or Ding Liren, goes knight to e8, intending knight d6. Then white can just go bishop f4, again intending knight d6 anyway, again with a brilliant position. So b5 here is required, hitting the knight before white can go bishop f4 and then knight d6 with the knight protected. Now here, Gukesh, he's got to retreat the knight. Bringing the knight to d6 would be very, very risky, but beyond that, white has a million different squares to move to. For example, knight e5, knight e3, knight d2, and knight to a3 are all playable. In the game, Gukesh does go knight to a3, keeping pressure on that pawn on b5. Now, Ding Liren, how does he want to defend? Well, b4 is one move, but that move is a very weakening move. Then white can just go knight to c4. That knight would be perfectly placed on c4. Therefore, instead, Ding Liren does defend the pawn with the move queen to b6, flying out with the queen over to the queen side. Now here, Gukesh, how does he want to proceed? Well, there are two main ideas here for white. One is bishop f4. That is the best square for the bishop, potentially defending a future d6 idea. And the other is d6 immediately. Now, the computer says d6 immediately is very playable. However, for a human player, that move does look a lot less flexible. So with that in mind, Gukesh does go bishop f4, and that is the move I like most in this position. The bishop just being very, very active. And now look at these two Bs on f3 and f4 just slicing down the board. I mean, they are very, very strong in this position. Now, Ding Liren, rook f to e8, finally getting his rook on f8 into the game, challenging the white one on the e1 square. Now, Gukesh, once again, he has the option of going d6, pushing the pawn, but instead he does go queen d2, centralizing the queen a little bit, supporting the bishop on f4, and of course, connecting those rooks on the back rank. I quite like this move by Gukesh. Now, Ding, rook a d8, centralizing his rook, and here Gukesh, he's got a very important decision to make. Most of his pieces are on good squares. He has to find the right good middle game plan to proceed. Now from here, you can go say rook a d1, that's playable. You can also trade rooks on e8, rook takes e8. Beyond that, king g2 is also decent, but instead Gukesh, he starts the process of rerouting his knight on a3 to a better square. I quite like this idea. He goes knight c2, and now the knight could be going to e3 in the future. Maybe. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Now here, Ding Liren, he has that pawn majority on the queen side. Therefore, his main way to get counterplay here is perhaps going a5 immediately or at some point in the future, threatening ideas like b4, c4, and so on. Instead here, he does simply go knight to f8. This is a slightly dubious idea. It's not really obvious what the knight is doing on the f8 square. After all, with white's pawn on d5, e6 is covered. Perhaps his idea, maybe, is if white goes d6 in the future, then knight to e6 could be a very strong move, a very good square for the knight. But Gukesh here, of course, he's not required to go d6. He's not in a hurry. And if he doesn't do that, then the knight on f8 is going to look very, very silly. All right, here, Gukesh, he proceeds with the move b4, gaining space on the queen side. This is quite a strong move, and it does synergize very well with the move knight to c2. Now here, Ding, what are his options? If he does nothing, Gukesh is going to trade on c4 or c5, b takes c5, trading off a pair of pawns, and then Gukesh will have that open c-file to work with. He may have some good counterplay on the queen side. Now, instead, let's say you trade on b4. C takes b4, then knight takes b4 is quite strong. And finally, if you go c4, yes, that pawn will be a protected pass pawn on c4, but it does weaken a lot of squares on the queen side, and white is going to have very good counterplay, potentially going knight d4, then knight c6, and so on later in the game. Now here, Ding Liren, he does go c4, locking down the queen side, and now the queen side is closed, but again, this does leave a lot of weak squares on the queen side, for example, d4, c3, and so on. Now here, Gukesh, in this position, he does proceed with the move bishop e3, putting pressure on the queen on b6. Now, technically, bishop e3 is not the main computer line. The computer likes rook takes e8 a little bit better, but bishop e3, not a bad move at all either. Now, of course, the queen is under attack. There's no good intermediate move. You gotta move the queen. The queen can go to a million squares here. For example, a6, d6, b7, b8, c7, and so on. In the game, Ding Liren does go queen to a6, keeping the queen quite active and keeping pressure on that pawn on a2. For example, if white does go rook a d1, normally a very logical move, then the pawn on a2 would hang, and things could get very spicy very fast. Now here, Gukesh, bishop d4 is the move. This is a very strong move, putting pressure on this diagonal and opposing that Grunfeld-style bishop on g7. Now, very importantly, that pawn on d5, it is being attacked twice by the rook on d8 and the knight on f6, and only defended once by the bishop. Now, can black just take on d5 mainly with the knight? Well, it turns out, yes, he can, but it is not a good idea. It is a blunder. For example, if knight takes d5, then the move is just bishop takes g7, then after king takes, bishop takes d5, and suddenly white is up basically an entire piece. Black traded his knight for the pawn. That is not a good trade. Therefore, knight takes d5, not recommended here. Instead, Ding Liren does have many different options. For example, knight 8, d7, getting his knight back into the game on d7, or h6 or h5 are also playable. Instead, in the game, Ding Liren does trade on e1, rook takes e1, trading off pair of rooks. Then we have rook takes e1, recapturing. This is the stronger recapture. Queen takes e1 would be a lot weaker. The queen would be misplaced on e1. However, here, very importantly, after rook takes e1, the pawn on a2 is undefended, and that was part of the entire idea by queen to a6 played earlier in the game by Ding Liren. Now, does Ding want to trade on a2? It turns out, yes, he does. He takes the free pawn. Queen takes a2, and what is the idea? If you go rook to a1, that is what Gukesh does, rook to a1, then the queen still has access to b3. Now, Ding, in the game, he did go queen b3, but it turns out there is a stronger idea here. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the stronger idea that is not queen b3 that Ding Liren either missed or decided not to play in this game. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, the best move for Ding is going to be c3, a temporary pawn sacrifice. Of course, if you take the queen on a2, then you recapture the queen on d2, and Ding Liren would have a beautiful position. Beyond that, if you go, say, queen takes c3, winning the pawn, then the queen has access to c4. That is the benefit of that temporary pawn sacrifice. It's a clearance move, bringing the queen over to the c4 square, where it is a little bit better placed. Now, instead, in the game, Ding did go queen b3. This move is a little bit dubious, and here Gukesh is starting to fight for a very serious advantage in this game. Now, he starts with the move rook to a3. Of course, the rook is defended by the knight on c2. Therefore, queen takes a3 is not a possibility. All right, where is the queen going to go? It gives the check on b1, queen b1, king g2, and now Ding does go rook d7, trying to defend that pawn on a7. Of course, it was being attacked twice by the rook on a3 and the bishop on d4. Therefore, white can still win that pawn on a7, but does he want to? Well, it turns out he doesn't want to do that just yet. Instead of trading on a7 with the rook or the bishop, here Gukesh does go rook to a5, putting pressure on the very weak pawn on the b5 square. Now, here, Ding Liren, how does he want to proceed? Well, it turns out defending the pawn on b5 with the rook b7, would be a massive blunder. If you do that, the problem is white can just take on a7, and then, very importantly, the rook is not blockading that pawn on d5. White's going to have the threat of just marching that pawn down the board later in the game, and white would have a virtually winning position. Now, instead of that here, Ding Liren, he does go queen to b3, flying up with the queen. Not a bad move at all. Now here, Gukesh, he repeats moves. Rook to a3, queen b1, rook b5, then queen to b3. Now, very importantly, Gukesh, if he wanted to draw, he could go rook b3, forcing queen b1, then rook to a5 again, and that would be a threefold repetition. It would be the third time both players had this exact position on the chessboard, and therefore it would be a draw on the spot. That is one of the rules of chess. Now, instead, of course, Gukesh, he's a fighter, and he is playing for a win in this game. So with that in mind, rook takes b5 is the move, winning the pawn on b5. Now, Ding, in the game, he does go queen d3, trying to centralize his queen, but it turns out this is a little bit inaccurate. Instead, you want to play the waiting move h6 or h5, waiting for a move like knight to e3, and only then going queen d3. Now, the problem with queen d3 immediately, instead of waiting for that move knight to e3, is here white has the option of bishop to e3, defending the queen on d2, and then after the queen trade, white would be excellently placed. Now, instead of that here, Gukesh, he does go queen to f4, keeping the queens alive. Again, Gukesh is a fighter. He wants those queens on the board. He wants to attack. Now, very importantly, this move queen to f4, it puts pressure on that knight on f6, white is threatening bishop takes f6, winning a free piece. But of course, this move also hangs that knight on c2, meaning both players could lose a piece here immediately. Now, does Ding want to go for that? Well, it is a very playable option, but the computer here finds an absolutely brilliant move. This move is just a total shocker. If you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find a shocker move right here in this position. All right, the key idea for Ding here, instead of queen takes c2, it's actually the shocking move g5, a literal pawn sacrifice. Here's the idea. After queen takes g5, you go h6, driving back the queen. And from there, the best square for the queen is actually c1. Instead, if you go queen takes g5, then a6, then queen to f4, then Ding Liren's going to go knight to g6. That is the idea of that pawn sacrifice. The knight jumps into the g6 square. It's very active there. Therefore, instead, after queen takes h6, then you must go queen to c1, not giving black that chance to go knight g6 with the gated tempo, and then black can actually go c3, and that pawn on c3 will be very dangerous. Black's pieces will be very active, and he will have very good counterattacking chances here. Instead, in the game Ding Liren, he does just trade on c2, queen takes c2, and then of course, Gukesh does trade on f6, bishop takes f6, and now bishop takes queen takes is one option, but instead, Ding Liren, he flies back with the queen. Queen to f5 is the move in the game, and here Gukesh, he does just trade off those queens. Queen takes and then g takes, and now we have a very complicated endgame. Here Gukesh does trade on g7, bishop takes, then king takes, and now rook c5, putting pressure on that passed pawn on c4. Now here we have knight g6, finally getting that knight back into the game. Now rook takes and knight to e5, putting pressure on both the rook on c4 and the bishop on f3. Now here the rook moves, rook d4, and now black has the option of knight takes f3, trading off those minor pieces, but instead Ding Liren plays a very flashy move. That is the move knight to c5. And of course, the knight is not hanging, it is poisoned. If you take on c6, then rook takes d4, wins the rook. Therefore, that is not a playable option. Instead, in the game, Gukesh does go rook to f4, putting pressure on that pawn on f5. Now we have knight e7, defends the pawn, and puts more pressure on d5. The threat now is knight takes d5. Now here, Gukesh, b5, pushing his passed pawn, king to f6 for Ding, then rook d4, defends the pawn, and h6. Now we have king to f1, and then Ding Liren. In this position, the strongest move is just knight to c8, retreating the knight, but the knight does do a very good job of controlling both d6 and b6, and it would be pretty hard for white to make significant progress in that position. But instead here, Ding, he does go king to e5. This move is a little bit dubious. It is very active. You are putting a lot of pressure on that rook on d4, but again, knight c8 was the right idea. Now here, Gukesh, he finds the strongest move immediately. You don't want to go say, I don't know, rook c4, rook a4, then just knight takes d5, wins back that pawn, and Ding Liren would be doing excellent. Instead, Gukesh, he maintains the pressure, rook to h4, flying over with the rook, pressuring the alpha 0 h-pawn on h6. Now here, knight takes d5 and rook takes h6. The h-pawn has fallen, and now we have knight c3, jumping down with the knight, putting pressure on b5. Now here, Gukesh, rook c6, pressures the knight on c3, and now, very importantly, that pawn on b5 right now, it is poisoned. You cannot take it if knight takes b5. Then rook to c5, hits both the king and the knight on b5. That would be game over on the spot as the rook forks the king and the knight. So instead here, knight to c4 is the move, keeping the knight alive and keeping it very well centralized. Now here, the computer says the best move for Gukesh and the best way to get winning chances is the move h4, the alpha 0 pawn marching down the board, and from there the threat is very simple. h5, h6, h7, and h8 promoting. That pawn would be very, very hard to stop. But instead, Gukesh, he makes a big mistake here. I don't know how to put it. King to e1, a very passive move. Yes, the king is a little bit closer to the center of the board. Yes, you do stop rook d1 ideas in the future. The king does control that square. But overall, this move does throw away a very large portion of his advantage. Now, Ding Liren, f6, gaining space on the king side. And now Gukesh does go h4, finally. But again, it would have been much stronger on the prior move. Now here, rook d3, flies down with the rook, pressures the bishop on f3. Now bishop d1 gets the bishop out of the attack, but instead king to e2 was the right move. The king would be much more active on e2, pressuring the rook. So Gukesh, playing a series of passive moves, king to e1, and bishop d1. Both of those moves were mistakes in this game, and now his advantage, as you can see by the eval bar on the left side of your screen, is collapsing. All right, from here, Ding Liren continues to increase the pressure. f4, gaining space on the king side, threatening f takes g3, and then knight takes g3 after f takes back. So Gukesh, of course, he trades on f4, g takes f4, but then king takes, and suddenly white's pawns on the king side are quite a bit weaker. And Ding Liren, look at his pieces here, the king, the knight, and the rook, all putting pressure on the white king. Gukesh is definitely on the, the defensive here. All right, bishop c2 hits the rook, then rook to d5, centralizing the rook. It turns out rook h3 was a little bit stronger. That would have been a better move for Ding Liren, but rook d5, not a bad move at all. Now, rook c4, sliding back with the rook, f5 for Ding Liren, supporting his knight on e4 that was being attacked twice by the rook and the bishop. Now, rook b4, putting the rook behind the passed pawn. We have king to f3 for Ding, a slightly weak move, very active, very aggressive, but it turns out king to e5, getting the king back and centralized was a little bit more prudent. Now, here, bishop d1 hits the king. King g2 for Ding, very strong, very active, rook b3, and then rook to e5, threatening all kinds of ideas like, for example, knight to c5 with the discovered attack on the rook on b3 and the king on the e1 square. Now, f4, putting pressure on the rook must move, rook to e7, maintaining the rook on the e-file with the x-ray attack on the king, very strong. Now we have rook e3, defending against the x-ray attack, and rook to h7, putting pressure on that alpha 0 pawn on h4. Now here, Gukesh, h5 is the move, pushing the pawn, knight f6, rook to e5, and then we have knight takes and rook takes f5, both sides trading off a pair of pawns. And here Gukesh, again, he does have the advantage in the endgame. He has those two pawns versus the one, and he has the bishop. That bishop is a little bit stronger than the knight on the open board with pawns on both sides of the board. And that means Gukesh is still fighting for the win here, but Ding Liren, he's an excellent endgame player. He's going to do everything he can to hold on. Now, knight g3, then rook to f8, and rook b7, putting pressure on the pawn on b5. How is Gukesh going to defend? Well, he does it with the move bishop a4. Very interesting, but now the bishop is very passive on the a4 square. Now we have king to f3 for Ding Liren. His king being much more active than the white counterpart. Now, f5 pushes the pawn. King f4 and then f6, once again pushing it. Now we have knight e4, centralizing the knight and threatening ideas like knight takes f6 in the future. Now, bishop c2 puts pressure on the knight, knight d6, putting pressure on that pawn on b5, rook d8, pressuring the knight, but now king to e5. Instead of trading on b5, he does defend the knight and pressures that pawn on f6. Now, bishop b3, knight to f7. The knight is blockading on f7 for now, and now we have rook d5, flying down with the rook, but now king takes f6. That other pawn finally falls, and now we just have two pawns on the queen side. We're going to have to wait and see if either side can make progress. All right, king d2, marching his king down the board is Gukesh. Rook b6, bishop c4, rook d6, offering the trade of rooks. Now, king c3, rook takes d5, bishop takes, and knight d6. Here, Ding Liren, his idea is simple. He just wants to trade on b5, knocking off that pawn, and if he gets it, white is not going to have enough material to fight for a win. So, king b4, and then sure enough, knight takes b5, a very good move. I'm giving that an exclamation point. Knight takes b5, then king takes, and of course here, either side can make progress, so Ding Liren just goes a6, and at this point, both sides agree to a draw. After king takes a6, there's going to be no way for either side to make progress. Wow, what a game between Gukesh and Ding Liren. I gotta say, Gukesh, he had very good winning chances in this game, especially if he found that one key move, h4. I'm trying to find where it would have occurred. Right here, in this position, if he just went h4 instead of the move king to e1 as played in the game, Gukesh would have had excellent winning chances. That was the big missed opportunity of this game. Just pushing that pawn down the board as fast as he could would have been the right idea. But overall, very good game by Ding Liren as well. He's showing, excellent tenacity in this series. It's going to be very interesting to see if Gukesh can get another win, or if it is going to go to the tie breaks, or even if Ding Liren can turn the tides. I mean, at this point, anything can happen. I think everyone is shocked by how well Ding Liren is playing in this game, in this match. All right, Chess YouTube, that's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, go and smash that like button and check out this video right here where I cover a beautiful game by Bobby Fischer where he obliterates the Dragon Sicilian of Brent Larson in just 31 moves. If you want to see some beautiful Bobby Fischer style attacking chess by the man himself, Bobby Fischer, check out that video and I'll see you in the next video.